Good morning and welcome to the Marin Communications Forum. This is a monthly meeting sponsored by First 5 Marin Children and Families Commission, and each month we bring a different public policy issue to the community and to share special topics with you, and very glad you could join us. Today we are very pleased to welcome the Public Policy Institute of California. Our speaker is Caroline Danielson, and she's going to be talking to us about safety net services and poverty prevention, and how these services really make an impact on meeting the difference between family incomes and making ends meet. They're really critical. And just to follow up on some recent research that we've presented, in December of 2017, we talked to you about making ends meet in Marin, and it was more of a focus on the income portion and the basic costs, the outrageous costs of housing and licensed childcare in this county. And I think we shared with you that the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom unit in Marin is about $3,000. And the average cost for licensed childcare, if you have one infant and one preschooler, is also $3,000 a month. So if for a working family with 2 youngsters, you can see that just as they get out the door in the morning, before any other expenses, they owe $6,000 a month. And that's tough. And at that time, we shared with you that the estimated cost of making ends meet had been set to be about $105,000. Well, by the time we presented that report to the Board of Supervisors, it had gone up. And now, I almost can't believe this, but the new numbers are out from the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, and you have this in front of you today. And for folks that are watching on video, you can get this from First 5 Marin by calling our office, 415-257-8555, and we will be happy to share this with you. So on the back side of this page from the Insight Center, at the very bottom, they kind of buried the lead here. They share with you that for a 4-person family, 2 adults, a school-age child, and a preschooler, the new cost of making ends meet is $129,313. What they don't share is the other family with the very young children. If you go on their website and look up the same information for a family with an infant and a preschooler, the cost of getting by in Marin, of making ends meet, is $545. $149,545. That's almost a 50% increase from the last time they issued this report. And I don't think many of us had a 50% increase in our salary since that time. So that makes the safety net services even more important. So now that we've had such a long introduction, I do want to bring Caroline Danielson up, and we will get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks for coming today. I'm pleased to have the invitation to speak about our research on poverty and the social safety net at the Public Policy Institute of California. Just to give you a little introduction, if you don't know the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit institute with offices in San Francisco and Sacramento, and our mission is to inform and improve public policy making in California. I work on issues related to health and human services and poverty, as I mentioned earlier. And today, what I'll be doing is focusing this work on young children and on Marin and the Bay Area to the extent possible with the data sources that we have. And so I'll be speaking about poverty, and I'll be speaking about the role of the social safety net in alleviating poverty and what else we might be able to do. Let me acknowledge at the outset that over the 5 or so years we've been doing this work, we've had some funding support at different stages from the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, from Sunlight Giving, and from the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment, and we're grateful for those sources of support. This work is joint with the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, and so I have colleagues at PPIC who work on the California Poverty Measure and colleagues at Stanford who do as well. And then finally, we have collaborations with several state departments in the California state government that help us to do the best job we can at measuring the role of the social safety net. And these departments include the California Department of Social Services that oversees CalWORKs and CalFresh and other programs. The California Department of Education, and here school meals figure in importantly. And then finally, the California Department of Public Health, where the WIC program is critical for young children. So today, I would like to cover 4 topics in the next, well, I guess 5 points, 5 broad points in the next 30 to 40 minutes. First is to just describe what we're doing with the California Poverty Measure. Self-sufficiency measures are a related set of things. The official poverty statistics that come out every fall produced by the Census Bureau are also a related set of things. So just to kind of place that in the realm of what we're talking about. We're all talking about economic need, but what do we mean? How are we speaking differently when we talk about the California Poverty Measure? And then to look at how California poverty, how we reassess it when we do this next generation updated measure of poverty in particular, and you've probably seen the headlines that California becomes the highest poverty state when you reassess poverty according to the supplemental poverty measure, and our California poverty measure is very much in line with the supplemental poverty measure. And then then third, to look at what sources of income, and I don't just mean cash income from jobs, but those sources, but also other kinds of sources that include the social safety net programs that I'm going to highlight, how they work together to help families make ends meet. And then how do they lift families out of poverty? And finally, what more could we do, in particular in California? And here there are both some ideas, but also some major challenges, and so I'll talk about both of those. And then we'll have a good amount of time, I think, for Q&A and discussion after that. So what is the California Poverty Measure? Any measure of what it takes to make ends meet, and we are talking about that in a rough sense. The self-sufficiency measure puts it at perhaps a higher level and doesn't think about the in-kind sources of assistance, all the kinds of sources of assistance that we do in the California Poverty Measure. But the official poverty measure, California Poverty Measure, supplemental poverty measure, self-sufficiency index are all sort of setting a line of what does it take to make ends meet, and then comparing that against family resources. So in the official poverty world, what families have on hand are their earnings and cash benefits. So that could include Social Security, it could include supplemental security income for blind, disabled, and elderly. It could include CalWORKs, cash assistance for families with children, or general assistance. It does not exclude expenses that families may face, and I'll get to that in a minute because the California Poverty Measure does. And then it compares against a poverty threshold that is adjusted for family size in the case of the official poverty measure. But when we switch to the California Poverty Measure, and this is very much, again, akin to the supplemental poverty measure, there was an effort by the National Academy of Sciences that was taken up by the Census Bureau, and they first released the supplemental poverty measure in 2012, and we first released the California Poverty Measure in 2013. And that updated next generation measure of poverty tries to take into account some of the large-scale safety net programs that came into existence or were expanded after the creation of official poverty, which happened in the 60s. And has not really been reconceptualized since then. We continue to use it, but it doesn't take into account some of the large-scale programs like tax credits, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the nutrition benefits, for example, the food stamps or SNAP or CalFresh program, as it's known in California, came into existence nationwide in 1974. This was after official poverty statistics were created and were never updated to include big, large-scale sources of support like CalFresh. and don't take account of expenses that families typically bear, like childcare, as Michelle mentioned earlier. Medical expenses, health-related expenses have become much more important in families' lives than they were in the 1960s, out-of-pocket expenses. And so that, on the resources side, the California Poverty Measure takes into account these social safety net programs, and I'm going to get to a list in the next slide so you can see one by one what they are. And that allows us to reassess poverty and then also take into account then take a closer look at what role those programs are playing in helping families to meet. How large is the role? How many families are out of poverty due to these programs? So I'm going to get to that too in a few minutes. The other thing that the CPM, California Poverty Measure, and the SPM, Supplemental Poverty Measure, do is instead of just adjusting the poverty threshold by family size, they adjust it for where you live and whether you rent, own, or own your house with a mortgage or without a mortgage. And so in the official poverty world, there's no difference between living in, say, Marin County or living anywhere else in the country, except if you live in Hawaii or Alaska. Now, we know it's much more expensive to live in Marin than it is in many parts of California and in most of the rest of the United States. But official poverty doesn't take that into account. It's the same poverty threshold, about $24,000 a year for a family of four. And so that means that Marin, according to the official poverty statistics, has a very low poverty rate, but it's not realistic. And home ownership status also, if you own your home without a mortgage, which is not true of very many people. It affects those who are generally older because they've lived in their houses for longer, but then you pay you have to assume different kinds of housing costs. So we take that into account. So the orange parts of the orange pieces of the puzzle are the ones that are different from official poverty, the ones we take into account in the CPM. And here's the list of programs, the social safety net programs, that I'll be delving into more as the presentation goes along. And on the left column, you'll see official poverty takes into account cash income, Social Security, supplemental security income, TANF or CalWORKs, and general assistance, but excludes housing supports, nutrition supports, and tax credits. And those end up being very important sources of poverty alleviation in California and other places. The Supplemental Poverty Measure and the California Poverty Measure do take into account all of those sources of income. Now, are there things left out still? Yes, of course there are. This is not the sort of be-all and end-all of every kind of assistance a family could avail themselves of. But it is a much more comprehensive assessment than official poverty statistics would give us. It also zeroes in on the largest social safety net expenditures that we see in California. And here's a bar chart showing you the annual costs for the state as a whole, or the annual amount of benefits supplied to families. And it's about $40 billion in total. And so that gives us, again, a sense of how we as a state and how as a nation, where are we devoting resources? And then if we want to think about where we might want to put more resources or perhaps reallocate resources, we can then start to think about that. So in California, it's about $40 billion total. The largest program in terms of benefits paid out to families is supplemental security income, SSI, SSP. The blue section of the bars is the federal portion. The purple or maroon section is the state portion, and then the orange section is the county portion. Because California budgeting between state and counties is complex, CalWORKs is not actually mostly paid for by. It's a special fund payment that is a swap, and it's not actually a expense that counties directly raise taxes to bear, but it is a state portion of the state budgets that's devoted to counties to help them pay for the cost of the CalWORKs program. So you can see that the major funder here is the federal government, which is a challenge and something that I'll return to at least once during this presentation. And you'll see that counties are not really on here to any great extent, except in the CalWORKs program, which, as I've already mentioned, is really a special fund, a state fund that is specially devoted for counties to administer or to pay benefits in the CalWORKs program. And general assistance, which really is a county responsibility, but is very small. It's in the few hundreds of millions of dollars. And this is really not a program directed generally speaking, at children or families with children. It's really meant for low-income single adults who don't have any other source of support. So it's in the mix of social safety net programs, but for purposes of today's discussion, it's not really a relevant program. Counties do play a very large role in administering eligibility and enrollment for most of these programs, not all of them, but many of them. So counties do play a very big role, but not in the funding sense. So once we reassess poverty, take into account the cost of living, let it vary across the state, but also take into account these large-scale, publicly provided safety net programs that we've put into place over the past 40 or so years, or massively expanded in some cases, compared to where they were in the 1960s, what happens to poverty in California? Well, overall, and this is the leftmost set of bars, California has a much higher poverty rate. We are, in fact, the highest poverty rate state in the country. District of Columbia is sometimes neck and neck or sometimes ahead. There's a few other states that are close to us, but we are, in general, the highest poverty state in the country because mainly of our cost of living. Our poverty thresholds, as I'll show you in a minute, are just much higher than federal poverty would let you believe. And so even though we're counting in more resources that families can have available to them, is outweighed by the much higher poverty threshold. So 20% or 1 in 5 of Californians overall, and here I'm not zeroing in on those young children that I'll be talking about more in a minute, but just all Californians, 1 in 5, or about 7.5 million Californians estimated to be in poverty in California, as compared to official poverty statistics, which would indicate about 15%. That puts us around 15th, 16th place in terms of where we are in the ranking nationwide under official poverty statistics. So we really do move up quite dramatically. In the Bay Area, the sort of 9 or 10 county Bay Area, poverty is, again, much higher. It's sort of in the realm of the average poverty rate in California of 20%, it's 17% according to the California poverty measure, a little bit below the average, but instead of being a low poverty part of the country, part of the California at 10%, we're up at 17%, which is closer to the average. And Marin is estimated to be sort of instead of a low poverty county, but closer to being around the average. Now, I will say for Marin, when we look at this, when we narrow down to the sample size that we have for Marin, even though Marin's one of the sort of 30 or so largest counties, it's still, there's a margin of error there of about plus or minus 2 percentage points. So it's hard to say whether it's definitely, it's definitely a little bit lower than the average in the state, but is it, a lot lower or a little lower? Our best estimate is 16%, but it's plus or minus 2 percentage points. As I mentioned, poverty thresholds are much higher when you take into account the cost of living in California. So on average, our poverty threshold for a family of 4, and you can think in your minds and compare back to the more Insight Center self-sufficiency threshold for a family of 4, which does vary by age of children and some other things. So there's more thresholds to take into account when you're thinking about that self-sufficiency index than in our measure. It's about $24,000 for the federal poverty line. California is about $30,000 for a family of 4. So this is really a basic needs threshold. This is not sort of moderate income families. This is the poverty threshold. It's still $6,000 higher than the federal. So that's substantially higher. That's 20% higher than you would think based on official poverty statistics. Marin is the second highest, has the second highest threshold in the state. For a family of 4, it's about $36,000. San Francisco at 37 is the highest cost county in the state, according to our estimates, and Santa Clara comes in third just behind Marin. So a big reason why poverty is higher in the Bay Area and in Marin is because it's just more expensive to live here, not news per se. We know this. So here I'm focusing in on children 0 to 5, and pretty much the rest of the presentation I'll be just focusing on children 0 to 5 and showing you these estimates and showing you where I can, Marin, but often Bay Area, to get in some more sample size. Children 0 to 5 end up being a fairly small sample, even when you're talking about the American Community Survey, which is the base source of our estimates, and that's a 1 in 100 approximately sample of Californians. So it's a pretty big sample for California. It's about 370,000 Californians a year are sampled. So that's a big sample in the realm of surveys, but still, once you narrow it down to children 0 to 5 in Marin, it gets to be pretty small. So here's the child poverty rate. Child poverty is, under official poverty statistics and CPM statistics, they're the highest poverty group across, adults, elderly, children. Children are the highest poverty group. In California, we have both the overall highest poverty rate and the highest child poverty rate. It's estimated 24% in poverty. Actually, we have a lower child poverty rate than official poverty statistics would lead you to believe, and I'm going to talk more about social safety net programs in depth in a minute, and I think you'll see that one reason that's the case is the social safety net does work. It really keeps children out of poverty. Many programs are directed at children, not all programs, but many are, and they're especially effective for children in deep poverty. So our deep poverty rate is actually lower under CPM and SPM estimates than it would be under official estimates. So that's good news. Again, looking at the Bay Area and Marin, the estimate is about the state average, and it could actually be higher, again, with confidence intervals, or lower. It does look like it's probably higher than the Bay Area as a whole. But again, instead of the Bay Area and Marin being low poverty parts of the state, we're more closer to being average poverty parts of the state. I should say that the highest poverty rate is typically, LA is one of the highest poverty places in the state. And again, this is a combination of having vulnerable populations, but also very high poverty, relatively high poverty threshold. Deep poverty, just in case you're not familiar with that term, is having resources less than half necessary to meet the poverty threshold. So deep poverty, 1 in 20 children statewide, and roughly the same in the Bay Area and Marin. And so that translates for Marin into about 3,000 children in deep poverty and about 11,000 in poverty. And those are overlapping categories. So deep poverty is just the group that is under half of the threshold, and poverty is everyone up to the threshold. So those 3,000 in deep poverty, approximately 11,000 in poverty. So racial disparities, and this is for the Bay Area. Not just for Marin. The dark blue line and bars are, again, deep poverty, and the lighter teal color is for poverty, and the line is showing the average for the Bay Area, and the bars are showing by some broad racial ethnic groups. And you can see that the poverty rate for Latino kids is the highest by far. And that this is true for African American children, but the good news is, again, deep poverty is much lower, but it is definitely above for Latino children. And for white and Asian children, poverty is substantially lower than the Bay Area average. So let me talk a little bit about sources of income. I've talked about, we need to update our sense of family resources and not just include earnings and perhaps cash assistance programs, but also income from these other important social safety net programs that if you have food assistance, then that can free up resources to help you, say, afford rent or childcare, so that they're not cash assistance, but they're resources that can help families make ends meet. But nonetheless, it's very important to start out with the point that most families in poverty work. And this is true of families even with young children 0 to 5. So this is showing the share of young children 0 to 5 who have at least one adult in their family unit who is working at any point during the year, and it's comparing California to the Bay Area. So if you look at all families with young children, whether or not they're in poverty, it's 92% California statewide and 96% nearly everyone in the Bay Area, because employment opportunities are generally good in the Bay Area. The cost of living is high, but there's there's more employment opportunities than some parts of the state, inland areas where there's more employment challenges. Even when you narrow it down to children in deep poverty, more than half are working. And again, the difference between the Bay Area and the state as a whole is fairly large. So it's over 2/3 of families in deep poverty, under half of the resources necessary to meet the poverty threshold, which is statewide about $15,000 a year. They're working at least at some point during the year, 2/3. And if you broaden it out to just those in poverty, it's about 3/4, 76% in the state as a whole, and again, substantially higher, 85%. So families are working, even when they have young children. Here, this narrows it down to just those who are working, report at least one adult working full-time full year. So this is really the other extreme of any work versus full-time full year work. And we see that clearly, if you look at all families with children 0 to 5, there's a difference between those families and those in poverty. Work pays. But those in deep poverty, we have 1 in 5 statewide, and nearly a third, 29% in the Bay Area, who are working full-time, full year, but yet are in deep poverty. And in poverty, it's over half, a little over half in the Bay Area and a little under half statewide, are report having an adult working full-time, full year, and yet they're still in poverty or deep poverty. So work is a really important source. And one policy lesson from this to take away is that safety net programs need to be able to support work. They need to be in the right place at the right time and there when families need them, because work is a key source of support. So let me show you for families in deep poverty. So this again is Bay Area children 0 to 5 who are living in deep poverty by our estimates. What are their sources of income? Well, a little over half are coming from what we call work investments in retirement. Now, for families in deep poverty, especially with 0 to 5, retirement's really not factoring in. But since we're looking at the range of Californians, in principle, that's a possible category, but it's not really a relevant category for today. The same thing with investments. Not really a relevant category. Work is what we're talking about when we're talking about that 54%. Nutrition assistance is really critical. CalFresh program makes up 20%, or $1 in $5 that families in deep poverty have with young children. WIC, another 7%, not surprisingly, because it's aimed at children up to age 5 and their mothers. School breakfast and lunch does add another 3%. This is not because the children who are 0 to 5 are getting those resources because they're not in school, but it's because they sometimes have older siblings, and those children can have access to school breakfast and school lunch. So adding those 3 categories of nutrition assistance together, we have 30% of family resources among families with children 0 to 5 living in deep poverty are coming from nutrition assistance, a really critical source of support. CalWorks is only 5%, despite the fact that it's our major cash assistance program for families with children. It does not, even for families in poverty, make up a very large set of source of resources. Tax credits is larger. That's the EITC and the federal child tax credit at 8%. And so this reflects the fact that families work, and therefore they're eligible for tax credits that are directly contingent on working. Housing subsidies is a very small source of support, so is SSI, SSP, because children are not very often disabled in the way that you need to be to qualify for SSI. It happens, but it's just not that common. And housing subsidies as well are rationed. They're not available to everyone who qualifies for them, and they're often aimed at special populations of need, and that doesn't as often include children, so that it's not, at least in the Bay Area, a major source of support for families with young children. And this is just broadening it out to the children in poverty, and you'll see that work becomes 2/3 instead of about half, but nutrition assistance continues to be important, and tax credits are also an important source of support. But CalWorks, housing subsidies, and SSI, SSP are still pretty small in the realm of things. So that's kind of the mix of resources that we estimate families have. And again, Bay Area children 0 to 5. Let me then talk about the protective role of social safety net programs. So something that we often do, and in the fact sheet that I brought today, and some of you may have picked up, we estimate the percentage point difference in child poverty or in poverty. If we zeroed out some of these programs, if these programs went away, what would poverty look like? And so this is what I'm going to show you now. The estimate of poverty, if we look only at children 0 to 5, and this is only looking at 2015, so some of the estimates I showed you combined years in order to decrease sample size. Deep poverty in 2015 is 4% in the Bay Area, and poverty 19%. But if we zero out those social safety net programs, that includes the nutrition assistance, the tax credits, and the other sources, including the cash assistance, CalWORKs, deep poverty would be 3 times what it is, 12% instead of 4%. So the social safety net is really doing an incredible job of protecting young children from deep poverty. Similarly, 8% higher poverty rate instead of 19%, 27% if we didn't have these programs. So it's doing important work. Do we still have a high poverty rate? Yes. Do we still have many children who need assistance? Yes. Are we doing much better than we would without the social safety net? We are doing much better. It's really important that $40 billion is buying us a lot. It is larger, generally speaking, in the state as a whole. These effects are even larger, and that's partly, there are a few things going on there, and it's hard to disentangle them. One of them is that the cost of living is so high here that some programs are less available to families. So if the income eligibility cutoff, which is usually a version of the federal poverty line multiplied by some factor, that is more out of whack here than it is in other parts of the state. So there's the social safety net is somewhat less available to families, can be somewhat less available to families because of that. But then there's other potential factors like whether families are actually taking up the resources when they have the ability to, whether they want to, whether they know about them, what are the barriers that are perhaps keeping them from taking up those programs. But generally speaking, the role of the social safety net is even larger if you look at the state as a whole. Okay, so now I'm going to zero in on 3 programs, and these are the programs that make individually the biggest difference in the child poverty rate in the Bay Area and statewide. Those are CalFresh, the food stamps program, the EITCs, which includes the federal and the state EITC, and the CalWORKs program. Even though CalWORKs is much smaller than it used to be and is relatively small in family budgets, it is still a pretty, one of the top 3 programs in terms of protecting children from poverty. So the line, again, is showing you the deep poverty rate in the left-hand blue section of the figure, and the maroon section on the right-hand side is the poverty rate. And the segments are showing you how much higher the child poverty rate would be in the Bay Area if we didn't have each of these programs alone. And so you can see that CalFresh is actually, it makes up the biggest share of family resources, and it's actually the biggest program protecting families from poverty. So not a surprise there. And the EITCs are also important, and they turn out to be even more important in the Bay Area and coastal parts of the state where employment is more accessible and available because you need to be working in order to have access to the EITCs. And CalWORKs is in the mix, but it is the 3rd largest. It's not by far the largest in terms of poverty alleviation. So I've been talking about what the social safety net does and trying to put a point on, the poverty rate, the child poverty rate in the Bay Area, how it shakes out when we reassess poverty more comprehensively and take into account the cost of living in California and in Marin and different counties in the state. We do pretty well with the social safety net, but we still have a high poverty rate. How could the social safety net do more is the topic that I would like to close with. And here I'm going to talk in fairly broad brush because there are a lot of programs and there are a lot of approaches that one could take. And certainly focusing in on one existing program is not a necessary, is not the be-all and end-all. There's no silver bullet. It's also true that depending on where you are in the state, the answer could be somewhat different. So having flexibility to make the solution be different across different parts of the state or even different regions within a county is probably critical. But let me make these three broad points, and then perhaps we can delve into some more in the discussion, some more specifics. So although these three programs, and here they're not the only programs that alleviate poverty. I talked about other programs, WIC, school meals, housing subsidies, but these are the three largest, so I'm going to focus in on them for the moment. Although they do protect children against poverty, if we look at just program participants and the poverty rates, the program participants' poverty rates are even higher than the overall child poverty rate. Not surprising, because if you are qualified for those programs, that means you have a fairly low, or perhaps for the EITCs, moderate income. So poverty rates are still high among, this is again, children in the Bay Area in deep poverty and poverty, children 0 to 5. Poverty rates are 41% for EITCs, 47% for CalFresh, and 42% for CalWorks, and this is among those who are getting resources from the program. So one could simply just think about increasing resources from those programs to current program participants. They're in poverty, they're getting assistance from the program. How could we target more resources to those folks, those program participants, to help them move out of poverty, to get closer to the poverty line, or move out of deep poverty? So that's one broad brush kind of approach, is these programs are already out there, they're already working, they're already doing good work. How could we just increase resources to folks to help them make ends meet? It requires careful targeting, because some folks are already combining resources and getting out of poverty through these programs. So you need to think about, then you would want to think about probably how you could target it to those who are still in poverty despite resources from the program. And would that be by age? Would that be by where you lived? Would that be by other characteristics? And it differs across these programs because they have different eligibility cutoffs. They have different other kinds of eligibility requirements. CalWorks is perhaps the most difficult because it's the most restrictive in terms of its work requirements and in terms of the capped allocation that we get from the federal government. The others are open-ended allocations, at least currently. So that's one approach that one could take. Another approach would be to say, you know, we know that a lot of kids in poverty don't actually get access to these programs. Do they have access to some programs? Yes. There's very, very few children in deep poverty and even in poverty who have access to none of these programs. But often it's WIC, or perhaps school meals. And so there's children who are definitely not getting access to one or more of these three largest programs. And so this bar chart is showing you these three largest programs in California and in the Bay Area. So those, and this is for children in deep poverty, just to put a point on those in the severest need. Of those in deep poverty in the Bay Area, 45% have access to the EITCs, state and federal, but 55% don't. CalFresh, 63% do, but 37% don't. And CalWorks, it's nearly 80% don't have access to CalWorks. So could you just take those program platforms and expand them to serve more kids who are not actually getting access to the programs in order to help them make ends meet? So just instead of focusing on the kids in the programs, focus on getting the kids into the programs that could qualify. Yes?
I'm just having a question about the CalFresh and CalWorks programs.
Mm-hmm.
Those are only on the database only for people who qualify for those because they're documented?
Yeah, so we should move to a more specific discussion of immigration status. I think that's a topic of interest to this audience, and so I want to do that. Yes, this is something that we try to be pretty careful about, to not over-allocate social safety net resources to families who wouldn't be eligible. So right now, at least, the CalFresh program serves children, citizens, of course, and then qualified immigrants, but not everybody in the family needs to have that status in order to qualify. Now, of course, there are proposed changes to public charge rules that could have a chilling effect. It wouldn't disqualify citizen children, but this is reflecting historical data that doesn't incorporate any kind of chilling effect. CalWORks similarly has similar kinds of rules. EITC, as you probably know, everyone needs to file with a Social Security number. There is a state bill out there right now, AB 2066, that it would, at least for the California EITC, make it possible to claim it if you file with an ITIN, an individual tax identification number. Again, there's a potential chilling effect from these potential changes to the public charge rule, but right now, everyone in the tax filing unit needs to file with a Social Security number, which is a limitation that is not really true of the other social safety net programs, where citizen children can't get access if they're living in a mixed status family. That is something that we're proposing to change, but only for the California EITC, which is has become a substantial program, but it's much smaller than the federal. We spend about $7 billion on the federal EITC, and the state EITC is less than $500 million, at least at this point in time. Yes?
I missed what EITC is.
I apologize. The Earned Income Tax Credit. So this is there's a federal version of this and a state version that kind of piggybacks on the credit. And so for each dollar earned when you're quite low income, especially if you have dependent children, it's available to families without children, but most of the dollars go to families with children. You can qualify on your tax return for a refundable credit, which means if you don't owe taxes, you can still get that as a refund on your tax return. If you don't owe taxes because your income's too low after deductions to owe any net federal taxes, you can still get it as a refund. And so that, on average, is a benefit for Californians who qualify of about $2,000 a year. So it's, relatively speaking, a big program. So in any case, these are the share of children in deep poverty who have access to these programs. You could think about expanding access. Now, just because 21% of children, for example, young children in deep poverty don't have CalWORks, that doesn't mean that those other 79% could get CalWORks. There are various reasons why some would not qualify potentially, and it's hard to say from the data we have who exactly would and wouldn't qualify. But CalWORks is the most underutilized program, and there are historical reasons for that, and it's not entirely clear that that would change, that could change very quickly, but it is a program that, relatively speaking, in California, we've supported more than many other states' TANF programs, which have shrunk even more dramatically than California's, but relative to where we were 25 years ago in our predecessor EFDC program, this program serves many fewer children in poverty. But similarly, there are missing children, so to speak, from these other programs, and at least some of them, not all of them, could qualify for these tax credits. For example, for the California EITC, there's definitely there's some underclaiming of that, less than for CalWORks, but there's definitely underclaiming. And a key reason for that is families aren't filing taxes, so some reasons have to do with being ineligible. But if you're eligible and you don't file taxes, then you don't get it. And so some research the California Budget and Policy Center did, and others, indicates that just getting families to file taxes, because when you have very low income, you may not need to file because you're not legally required to file, but you still these days can qualify for a tax credit, so it benefits you to file. But if you don't know that and you haven't been required to file taxes, then just filing taxes can benefit you, even though you don't have to legally because your income is so low that you're not required to. So getting more people into the tax filing world could boost the impact of the EITCs. CalFresh, we've had historically a low participation rate. About half of eligibles a few years ago were actually getting CalFresh. Now we're up around 70%, which is really good news, but there's still a ways to go, and we can continue to increase the enrollment in the CalFresh program to help families in need to get access to that. Okay, finally, we can consider, broad brush again. We released a report called Reducing Child Poverty in California last November, and we looked at a few scenarios. Now, just a few. There could be many scenarios of how could you expand programs to further assist families in California, taking into account the differences that across the state in terms of cost of living and employment opportunities, and taking into account different approaches. And we looked at 3 kinds of approaches. We also looked at minimum wage and some housing scenarios. But for today's purposes, we looked at 3 approaches: increasing the state EITC, instead substituting a child credit that would not be contingent on work or on having a Social Security number to file, and then finally a renter's credit that would fill the gap for renters who are housing burdened. We do currently have a non-refundable, very small renter's credit. But we explored the idea of a much larger renter's credit that would actually fill the gap so that you would pay no more than half, which is still a large portion, but still no more than half of your income in rent if you rented. So of those 6, and we looked at scenarios that were targeted at the very lowest income, and then those who were targeted more at the low and moderate income. And the reason we did both of those is because in some parts of the state, really employment and having any income is a big challenge. But in the coastal high-cost parts of the state, it's more, you may be working, but you're just not making ends meet because the cost of living is so high. So supports that move a little bit higher up the earnings spectrum and give families more robust support at those earnings levels that are still keeping them in poverty but are not in the deepest poverty seemed important. So we looked at 6 scenarios: EITC, child credit, renter's credit by lowest income versus low and moderate income. And turns out for Marin, and there's an interactive on our website. If you Google reducing child poverty in California and PPIC, or even just reducing child poverty, you'll bring this up. You can zero in on each county in the state. It turns out for Marin, an EITC, an expanded EITC, sort of along the lines of the expansion in 2017 that expanded a small credit to everyone making up to about the state minimum wage, full-time minimum wage. If you expanded that even more to make it more generous, in Marin, this would be the biggest child poverty impact, 2.8 percentage points lower than the actual child poverty rate in Marin. And it would assist quite a swath of families in the sort of the mid-range spectrum of just below poverty and just above poverty. So 44% of those just below poverty and 43% of those just above poverty. Not very many at the very lowest poverty levels and not very many higher up, but the targeting sort of right in the middle of right around the poverty line. In Marin, this is the scenario in our estimates that had the most robust impact on child poverty. Statewide, the answer is actually different. And that is, it's a child credit, and the child credit that would be available to families whether or not they actually had earnings and whether or not they were filing with Social Security numbers for the EITC. Just assisting families with a certain amount of money per child that they had would actually lower poverty, we estimated, by 4.4 percentage points statewide. It's not the biggest impact policy in Marin and perhaps other parts of coastal California, but it is the biggest impact statewide. So the policy solutions are not necessarily the same all across the state, which is, I think, not surprising, but it does prompt a conversation of sort of the diversity of poverty and how we can think about both, statewide solutions that work, but also solutions that are tailored to the individual circumstances that different parts of the state face. So this is a report, an interactive that you can check out on our website and explore. Encourage you to if you have the time. It's, there are clearly other approaches to reducing poverty, other kinds of programs. I didn't mention the WIC program apart from, its mix in the role of social safety net programs. It's not a large program. It's not one of the largest programs in terms of reducing child poverty, but for this audience and thinking about children 0 to 5, is an important program because it reaches so many young children that you could think of that program as a platform for policy changes that could help more young children, just because so many young children are served by that program. So if your particular focus is that, then then the WIC program could entirely make sense. So there's, this is when maybe we should open up for discussion now. Let me just close by sort of challenges that as I said, and the social safety net is really driven by federal dollars, and there are federal constraints. There's a lot of state flexibility, and there's been more flexibility over the years in terms of how California can control its programs, but there are still important federal constraints in terms of funding, now in terms of potentially increasing the public charge rule, or broadening it to include many of these programs that were historically excluded. So there's important federal policy challenges. There's no ready way for the state without ponying up a lot more money than it does right now in terms of supporting the social safety net that we can easily address. So there are important challenges. But even protecting what we have is critical because it's doing important work. And could we do more? I think that's the realm for policy discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. So Caroline mentioned a couple fact sheets that she brought along today. Those are out front on the table. There's one on child poverty in California, one on the Earned Income Tax Credit in California, and one on CalFresh Food Assistance Program. So feel welcome to grab those on your way out. And thank you to those of you who were able to bring canned food and dry food. And if you work with families in the area, if you would like to take that back with you for distribution, see me after. Now we'd like to take questions or comments, or if you want to share something that your organization is doing, here we go.
I was just wondering if you would mind repeating the policy solution that would have the most robust impact on childhood poverty in Marin. I just want to make sure I understood it clearly. I got the California one, but just the Marin County specific.
Yeah. So just a little bit more background. Because the California EITC was first launched in 2015 and then expanded in 2017, has been on policymakers' minds, we sort of focused on an approach that would increase the EITC. We looked at direct boosting the amount of dollars that we put towards the EITC. We also looked at this child credit scenario, which wouldn't make it contingent on working. You would just get an amount for, a child credit for, assisting you with the expenses of having children. And then we looked at this renter's credit. Turns out in Marin, the most robust child poverty impact is for just expanding the EITC. But we looked at a scenario where you expanded, the original California EITC was very focused on families with earnings below, so families with dependent children had to have earnings below about $14,000 a year. So that's deep poverty in order to qualify for anything. So the biggest impacts were for families making around $7,000, $10,000, like the biggest amounts for the state EITC. They're at the very low income spectrum. So in Marin, we looked at a scenario more akin to what they did in 2017, which is to give a small, in the few $100s level, credit to families making up to about the state minimum wage, about $22,000 a year for families with dependent children. We looked at boosting that credit to make it larger for families in that kind of minimum wage, but even a little higher income range. And that's the child poverty impact that was largest relative to the other ones that we looked at in our report for Marin.
Hello, excuse me. I wonder if you could speak to the role of childcare subsidies on poverty, because I didn't see them in your pie chart. Yep. And since childcare costs are such a big issue, I wondered if you could speak to that and how childcare subsidies have an impact on deep poverty and poverty for families.
It's a very good question, and it's one that we've had on our minds for a few years, and we've actually launched a project to really look at that. I can't right now give you an answer to that question, at least not in the framework of the California Poverty Measure, and nobody else can, as far as I'm aware of right now. I mean, from talking about the cost of childcare, yes, and then the amount of resources needed to make ends meet in the self-sufficiency world. But right now, we treat childcare costs as an out-of-pocket expense that working families face, and so we don't factor in explicitly the role of subsidized childcare. But we recognize this is a real limitation that we could incorporate in our framework, and we're actually working on that right now. And we expect to have a report in about a year-ish. It's got
We'll
a few
invite you back.
moving parts. Yeah, to talk specifically about that, because it is such a critical piece. So right now, it's sort of factored in as like an expense that families don't face. If you have a subsidy, then you don't face that expense, but it's not in there positively as, wow, if you didn't have that, how much more would you, how many more people would be in poverty?
Yeah, it would really be so helpful to those of us that advocate for more subsidies to have a picture of where it fits into the pattern.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I recognize that, like all of these programs, like nutrition assistance, it's about getting healthy nutrition. It's about avoiding food insecurity. It's not just about economic security. Our lens is economic security. For childcare subsidies, we want to look at the economic security aspect, the early childhood education aspect, the family, mobility aspect are also other important. But we'd like to take that look at how it improves economic security, because we feel like it's an important piece of the puzzle. So stay tuned.
It is, certainly. Luckily, we have a couple people here who work directly in the childcare field, so let's hear from them.
Well, I wasn't going to specifically talk about, I could, but I wanted to ask a question because the slide that really struck me the most was the revenue sources for the family and employment wages being
the pie chart?
Yeah, and the 50 to 67%, I think it was. So it got me thinking about, yes, I mean, I agree with the comment about affordable childcare, and childcare subsidies are absolutely critical to a working family. And I was thinking about all the work around advocating for low to middle skill jobs in Marin County and how there's such a need, and not many of us are. I think there could be more advocacy in that area, and I know Marin Economic Forum has started looking at that. So I know for me, I'm going to start looking at that more because, as long as we're not offering these types of positions in Marin County, we're going to keep losing families who are going to either commute out or move because there's just not going to be the jobs available for them to stay. So, yeah, we have a lot of work to do.
Absolutely.
One of the issues that I've faced with my families who are low income is the housing prices here in Marin, and many have had to move out of Marin and out of the Bay Area entirely. So I'm wondering about advocacy for housing subsidies, and I'm kind of curious about how things happen in Sacramento. Are there lobbyists, I hope, working to boost always the percentages of any of the safety net programs? Are they working around the clock? I hope so. I'm curious as to how these percentages would be increased, just how it would happen advocacy-wise.
I mean, I think advocates work on different margins of, making the programs more accessible by lowering barriers, improving benefits. There's certainly pushes to make sure that there's COLA increases or try to make sure that there's COLA increases. Unfortunately, when we're in recession, the state budget shrinks, of course, and the recent, not so recent, but very severe recession that we experienced, and there's more economic need, but the state budget shrinks, and so when the federal dollars step in, they're really critical, but we still did shrink programs. We shrunk childcare subsidies, we shrunk CalWorks, and so it's an unfortunate fact that when the economy is booming, we feel we can afford these programs, but then when times bind and our revenue sources go down, we tend not to be able to support the programs at the same level. So that's a challenge. But advocates have been working to restore both the amount of benefits and the access to the programs over the years. And given, CalWorks is the program that's most under sort of state control, in terms of the policies and procedures to access and the benefit levels. The other programs are much more under federal purview, although there's certainly state room for involvement. And so the answer depends a little bit program by program, what the advocacy solutions are.
And there is lobbying going on about housing. As you can imagine, it's a very controversial issue, both on affordable housing and on housing subsidies. And a first step to do would be to share information with our representatives, to let them know about the costs and challenges that our clients and coworkers are facing. So you want to get that information to Assemblymember Mark Levine and to State Senator Mike McGuire. You can write to them both at State Capitol, Sacramento, California, 95814. Their personal information is also obviously available online, but I mean, the first thing would be to get the data. And Marin County in particular is one of the most extreme examples of costs and affordability challenges. So that would be a first step. Get another question here.
Yeah, I wanted to know how much of these programs are available to families that are undocumented?
Sure. So the landscape is changing potentially. So let me speak historically and then say something about the public charge rule, but others may be more informed specifically about the potential changes than I am. So I'll just say something and then others can correct me or add more information. So historically, it's always been the case that citizen children, with the exception of tax credits, and that is not entirely clear to me why that's evolved the way it has, but with the exception of tax credits, citizen children have always been eligible for these programs, even if their parents or other family members are not. Typically, a family will apply as a family unit, but in the cases where there's a family member who does not have documentation status, they're allowed to be, they can be removed, not taken into account in the unit in terms of calculating the benefit amount to make the children still eligible. Now, the family would get a smaller benefit amount, and if you think of it as family sharing resources, which we do, we think of it as family sharing resources, and so if a child gets a WIC benefit, it helps, and that covers the cost of some, baby food and fruits and vegetables, that helps the family for maybe a school-age child afford that or afford their rent, so they kind of, use their budget and reallocate their dollars. So that makes the programs less available to them. If they have one or a couple members who are not eligible, say for CalFresh, they may get a benefit, but it would be a smaller benefit than they had documentation status. But they're not, so if they're citizen children or any other citizen or qualified immigrant members, they can get access even if other members are not eligible for the program. Now, WIC and school breakfast and lunch have traditionally not asked about documentation status. There is a Supreme Court ruling basis in the school meals category, so that it's there's Supreme Court ruling from Texas in the 1980s, I believe, saying that access to public schooling is a right of being of a resident, and so you cannot inquire about documentation status. For WIC, it's traditionally not been asked, but my understanding of the proposed, but not yet formally in the public comment period, but potentially proposed public charge rule would be that the public charge, so this would be participation in public programs could adversely affect an application for change in immigration status or bringing in a relative under family reunification, that those programs are to have typically, that the public charge portion of that, are you likely to become a public charge and rely on public benefits? That has been traditionally limited to cash programs, and that there is the potential that it would be massively expanded to include WIC, tax credits, and Medicaid or Medi-Cal and some other forms of public assistance, and that would mean, with a potential chilling effect, that citizen children, even though they're technically eligible, their families might not want to claim those benefits for fear of that they might then face difficulties in pursuing immigration status changes. So, but that's information that others can supplement and correct if I'm wrong on some of those details.
Just, yeah. Erica Erickson, coordinator for the Marin County Childcare Commission, and I want to share for the ones that were talking about childcare, and the contractors of state contractors for childcare know about this, but I want to use the opportunity to raise public awareness about the program that we are starting to implement in Marin, that was made possible because of legislation that we passed last year. Thanks to the co-sponsorship of Assemblyman Mark Levine and Senator Mark McGuire, the bill was AB 435 and allowed us to create, to change some of the regulations of childcare contracts here. Marin is one of the most expensive counties to live, as you know, in California. And to qualify for childcare, pretty much you have the same income eligibility ceiling across the state. So now with this legislation, we are able to to increase that income ceiling. So for example, for a family of 4, nowadays you can qualify for subsidized childcare if you make maximum $54,000 a year. With this pilot program, that's 5 years duration that we will implement in Marin, the families will be able to make up to $68,000 a year. So it will increase significantly for families to qualify. We also will be able to change some of our other regulations. For example, qualify families instead of 12 months, qualify then for 24 months of childcare after they are certified for it. So this little change will make a big difference, and we will not be using additional funds for that. We are going to be using pretty much the same funds that we receive from the state, and we will address the issue that we were having of returning funds to the state that we were not using for childcare. As an example, from 2013 to 2016, we returned more than $1,600,000 in childcare funds to the state, and these funds went to the general fund, and they don't return to us. So we will be able to address this issue with this little change. So yeah, that's super important, and we are excited to be working with local childcare contractors, including the North Marin Community Services and others that are in the room. So we will be able to serve more families with this little change. So I want to use the opportunity to share this good news. Yay.
Thank you. I think that's a really good example of thinking about how the solution is not one size fit all, and is a solution from a childcare example, but where other programs there may need to be potentially more flexibility in the way that we calculate eligibility or benefits, or different kinds of programs that kick in differently for families in higher cost versus lower cost parts of the state. Lower cost parts of the state, employment, simply just finding employment may be more of a challenge, and here it may just be that wages are too low to support, families, so that there are different kinds of solutions that can work.
Right, speaking of the lower cost portions of the state, in those counties, the $68,000 ceiling might sound relatively high, but when we think back to the number that we talked about before, rent for a 2-bedroom unit at $3,000 a month, licensed childcare for an infant and preschooler at $3,000. If that's $60,000, then, the $68,000 ceiling isn't very high at all. So thank you. We're looking forward to that program. We had another comment here.
Yeah, you mentioned, I'm Dan Monte. I'm running for State Assembly. And you mentioned a little bit about minimum wage. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that spreading or expanding who's eligible for minimum wage and overtime pay? And have you looked into the effects of increasing minimum wage on this?
So in the report I mentioned, and I apologize, I didn't attempt to bring, interactivity to the presentation. So I don't have a means of pulling up the website, but for today, but you're certainly, encourage you to take a look yourself. We did look at the planned expansions, the increases to the minimum wage, up to $15 an hour by, I believe, 2022, unless some of the escape routes are pulled if we have a recession. So we did look at the poverty effects of increasing the minimum wage, and there are poverty effects for doing that in the few percentage point range. And again, we were focusing on children 0 to 5. And so it is clearly a piece of the puzzle, especially since many families have work. I think as I've been saying all along, the solutions are different across different parts of the state. I mean, an increase over several years from $10 to $15 an hour affects more people in inland parts of the state than it does in coastal parts of the state. It also, in the end, affects fewer families with children than other kinds of families because the minimum wage affects younger workers more than affects older workers, and the other reasons for that. So the minimum wage is an important policy lever. It's not one that's very well targeted to families with young children, but it is an important policy lever, and there's more information about that on the website for this report. And I think there are some other resources on our website about the minimum wage in general, and I think the Berkeley's Labor Institute has some additional information about specifically the minimum wage in California and anticipated increases.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Time for one more question, and if anyone else had a question, please join us after. So one more here.
Thank you. I'm Roxana Guzman with Venetia Valley Community Family Center. My question is, looking at your chart here with the educational attainment and with the existing social services, is there any correlation on, I don't know, or is any of the fundings probably it's not even you, probably this is more like a state question, but our students face the same issue as qualifying for childcare when they're trying to apply for scholarships for whatever reason, for after school, for programs like that. Is education in any of those charts or scholarships consider social services? And
so I'm not sure I understand. Are you asking whether resources the families might get to help support education, are they included in the family budget, in like this pie chart as a family resource? Is that?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, possibly. It's hard to say. So what in this blue segment there's an other category, sort of other income that you have that's not specifically work or one of these specific programs. And so that other category is pretty small, but it could include child support, it could include workers' compensation, it could include something like educational support. So it's potentially in there. It's not something that, with the data we have, we're able to break out. One great resource for, it would be wonderful if the state or even counties, but maybe the state is a better candidate for this, had the ability to sort of combine information, with lots of protections for privacy around the different kinds of supports to sort of better understand holistically, like not just how many people are on the caseload or how many people left, but how that's supporting the bigger picture of their family. But we don't have those data. We rely on surveys like the American Community Survey, which is a great source, but is still limited in how much information it does collect. And that's a piece that we just don't have detail about. But especially for the families who get it, is a critical source of support, I'm sure. So I can't really answer your question, and I apologize, but I think it's a data need that I think if we're going to focus on what role these public programs, not just the ones I've listed, but other important ones, what role they play in families' lives, we ought to try to paint a more holistic picture, if we can, of like how they contribute to family resources, so that we can be able to tell that story in support of the programs and be able to understand the work it's doing for families. In the short run, I think there's also the educational benefit of having that could help someone achieve their educational goals. And then in the future, have upward mobility. That's also a very critical piece of the picture too. So being able to say things about that as well. But just, bringing these pieces together took us a fair amount of work, and we're really relying on census survey sources supplemented with some state data sources, but having the state play a bigger role in sort of bringing these data sources together to be able to build that case and be able to say it for different parts of the state and is, I think, critical. It's not something that they're taking on right now and that we ourselves can take on, but it does seem like it's a data need that could help build better public policy in the future.
Thank you. That's actually a really good point. And First 5 Marin and Marin Kids are both working to share data with our policymakers, both at the local and state level. It's a critical piece of advocacy, and to be able to have information from such a reliable source is really helpful to all of the work that we do. So if you want more information, you can look at this related report and also their interactive reports from the Public Policy Institute of California at ppic.org. And if you would like to get more information about upcoming forums, we track most of this on Facebook, and that's at facebook.com/Marin Communications Forum, and we announce all of our events in advance. And obviously you can also just give us a call at First 5 Marin, 415-257-8555. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.